Lindsey, it's so nice to have you here. I always love to interview people, experts on gut health, because I feel like there's just like, we're just hitting the tip of the iceberg. There's so much to know. This is an ever evolving field, kind of like the nutrition field. I feel like anytime I am interviewing a gut health expert, and I know you do a lot with autoimmune as well, we get some really good tips and some practical applications. So welcome to the podcast. It's
Thank
lovely to have
you.
you here. Why don't you
Yeah.
start by just telling us a little bit about your background and how you got so interested in gut health and autoimmune health?
Well, my background initially was not in medical stuff at all. My initial career was in international education. I was a study abroad advisor. Well, I was a French and Spanish teacher first, then I was a study abroad advisor. And ultimately, I ended up starting a nonprofit advocating for healthier food in the Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland, just outside of DC. And that got me, I had always been interested in nutrition just as a personal thing, but that got me really deep into the world of nutrition. And so it was in that context that I learned about health coaching and thought, that sounds like a good next career. So after I had sort of accomplished my goals in terms of improving the school food, and I moved on and I moved out of the area, I prepared by doing the training as a health coach. But it was my own personal experience with gut health issues that started with an episode of food poisoning when I was living in Costa Rica. And that then sort of over time began to manifest themselves once I moved back to the US. And that ultimately turned into autoimmune disease. There were other things that went on, like infertility, endometriosis. And sometimes it's hard to unwind what caused what, but I do think that the beginning of it was the food poisoning that led to what's called autoimmune IBS, which is essentially SIBO or small intestine bacterial overgrowth, where like every time you eat, you bloat out to here, like you have that food baby. And that's coming from the fact that you get this you get this immune reaction against the bacteria and the toxin in the bacteria that causes food poisoning. And then that causes a molecular mimicry where you've got in your own system a protein that resembles that toxin called vinculin, and that's involved in the migrating motor complex, which is what clears food out of your intestines. And so if you don't have that, after you eat, an hour and a half roughly after you eat, you're supposed to have these cleaning waves to pull all the bacteria out of your small intestine. If you don't have that, then they start to build up and build up. And then every time you eat, you bloat because they're fermenting food in your small intestine. So anyway, that was sort of the beginning of it all. So I developed Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and I was diagnosed with ITP, which is idiopathic thrombocytopenia purpura or something like that. And it was a low platelet count, basically, that was supposed to be autoimmune, but they took that diagnosis away from me later. And then pernicious anemia, which is inability to digest B12 in your stomach because of an autoimmune attack on the cells in your stomach. So it was like all these things happened at once. And that was when I really just woke up and was like, the doctor said, you just have to sit and wait until your thyroid gland is slowly destroyed by Hashimoto's. And then you'll probably have to have it removed and just be on thyroid hormone for the rest of your life. And I was like, no, that's not how this is going down. I'm going to be turning this around. And then I started really digging deeper into alternative healing methods and, found people who are experts in this and turned it around. I have zero, my antibodies for like 4 years now have been at normal in Hashimoto's. And only thing that remains is I still have to take sublingual B12 and I still have the autoimmune IBS, but I keep it very well managed. So
yeah, it's so crazy. Well, kudos to you for trying to improve school food, because it's no easy feat. So going to that part of your story, I've worked in the schools and I see what kids are eating. But going a little bit deeper into your story, it's so crazy so you were traveling when this happened, and you can likely link it back to that. It's so crazy how this happens, because like I can relate, like our son was completely normal digestion for 10 years of his life. And then all of a sudden when he was 10, he had this horrible gas for like 3-4 days. We're like, what is going on? And we don't know, like we weren't traveling, we weren't doing anything other than like we stayed in some hotels for a couple of days. We were eating out more often because he was playing basketball at the time, and we were like at a tournament. And then all of a sudden, like he started like pooping constantly. And then he got blood in his stools, and then was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. And then it was 3 years of nonstop, like uncontrolled. It was terrible. And to this day, like he's been, in remission per se for 5 to 6 years now, but I feel like his microbiome is still not like where it was when he's now 19, but it's just wild how one thing that you intake or that can really just wreak havoc on the gut microbiome. And like you said, like you're just kind of gaslit. You go to the doctor and they say, sorry, this is just how your digestion is going to be for the rest of your life. And you got to deal with your thyroid going kaput on you. And I don't know how old you were at that time, but let's dive deeper into your story. Like, how did you uncover like the whole process of knowing that something was off in your gut? Like how did you go about testing? Who did you work with? And like, how did you start to recover from your issues?
So the first thing, I noticed that I had soft stool, loose stool, multi-wipers. It was just not very pleasant. And I went to the doctor and, he said, well, is it formed? And I'm like, well, yeah, it's formed, but it wasn't full on diarrhea most of the time. But, he did the endoscopy. I think I had some reflux at the time as well, which often comes with SIBO. You have, this upward pressure. And so you end up getting some reflux. I did stop eating dairy, which is one of the primary foods. If you've heard of the FODMAPs, the fermentable oligosaccharides, monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polyols, which are the fermentable foods that cause that gas and SIBO. So I did, when you pull out gluten and dairy, you've pulled out the vast majority of those. So I pulled out dairy first. I think, I did some elimination diets. I'd read some books and such, but so I did ultimately get rid of most of the reflux by getting rid of the dairy. But at any rate, he did the endoscopy and there was nothing found. At that time, they didn't suggest a colonoscopy. And so there really was nothing more with conventional medicine that was to be done at that point. So then I started, looking for books about the gut microbiome, and I had read Missing Microbes. I actually, for years, was super convinced that I needed a fecal transplant and that was going to solve all my problems. And because I had read about that, and I knew that was being done for C. diff. I knew that people were beginning to experiment and do it for other things like ulcerative colitis or for IBS and that. So I talked about
the United States, right? I mean, you can't unless you have a C. diff infection. Good luck.
Correct, but you can if you can get your own stool and do it yourself.
Yes, or have a donor, because we actually went that route for a while, but it's
Well, so I talked, my husband had great stool. He was healthy. He had all the things. I was already sharing all the germs.
Yeah.
And so this was before I was a coach or anything like that. This was while I was still working and study abroad. And I just kept saying, I'm going to do it one day. I'm going to do it. And finally, one day I just did it. and I was
enough where you're just like, I'm done with this. I'm not living like this forever.
Yeah. And I was in communication with my doctor. I had a hematologist who was more open-minded, and I said, let's, we'll do a before and after. So we checked my B12 and my, I guess the ITP and maybe the antibodies before and then after for Hashimoto's. And the only thing that actually changed was my B12 levels shot up because the gut bacteria produce their B vitamins. So the B12 level shot up right after the fecal transplant, but it slowly went back down, and I did not get the ability to digest B12. And I think that's also partially now I've learned in my genetics that I have a low capacity for absorbing and using B12, and it has to be methylated B12, and I have to use a sublingual form of it and let it melt under my tongue so it gets absorbed into the bloodstream straight from my mouth. So but ultimately what happened was I did ultimately go and see a functional medicine doctor. So I knew I had heard about functional medicine, and amazingly, I had an insurance plan that had a functional medicine doctor on it, and you had to pay an extra fee to be part of that practice, but you were able to go and charge some of these tests and such to insurance, and some, mostly to pay for the supplements and such. So I went through that route, and I think I went through some herbal antimicrobials first, and they didn't quite do the job. then I did a round of rifaximin and I did low FODMAPs diet, and I did, supplemental betaine HCl for my stomach acid and all that stuff. And eventually did feel better, but then saw it recur. And it was then that I was starting to become trained as a health coach and starting to read up more. And I did my own protocol based on one of Isabella Wentz's books on the Hashimoto's, and went off the gluten and the dairy for good, and just brought those antibodies. They kept coming down until they were in the normal range. And then I just stuck with it for a long time.
Okay. Yeah. Rifaximin is one of, so my son has taken like a triple antibiotic cocktail for years, very low dose, and he only takes it a couple times a week. Mm-hmm. Rifaximin is one of his, and we've talked at length. Now he's 19. He is in charge of his own healthcare, which is mind-boggling because I know so much about his health, like his disease state, and he's just not interested in learning about it. He's at college. And so I'm like, I cannot believe I have no say, no nothing. Like, he's got to go do everything on his own, his labs and all of that. But yeah, I at some point, I know he's going to be more interested in reestablishing the healthy gut microbiome.
Yeah.
More extensively. So for you, it was more diet related and supplementation, and just long-term gluten-free, dairy-free.
Yeah, I can eat the gluten now. Like okay. It's been after 3 or 4 years when I was, the antibodies kept coming back zero, and I'd introduce a little bit more gluten. Yeah, more like good quality organic sourdough bread, only occasional random crappy food at restaurants that had gluten, but mostly just good quality stuff. Yeah. So I find that now I feel pretty safe that I can continue to do that and not get back the Hashimoto's.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that. Like how the autoimmunity tends to occur when you have a messed up gut microbiome, because we've talked about on the podcast how the gut lining in the digestive tract is one cell wall thick. So it's really easy to disturb it. And then on the other side of that one cell wall thick is the immune system. So if the integrity of the gut lining is compromised, there's the immune system waiting on the other side. So help us understand how those autoimmune issues can just flare and develop when you don't have a good, gut health, and the walls of your lining could be compromised.
Yeah, so there's any number of potential routes, but start with, you have any kind of dysbiosis, meaning that you do not have a good balance of good and bad bacteria, which say roughly 85% of your microbiome should be beneficial or commensal bacteria. And you can have 15% floating around there somewhere, but then you get overgrowths. And so depending on where and what kind, it can cause intestinal permeability. So then you start to have, and gluten is particularly implicated, especially in Hashimoto's, because it does resemble the cells in your thyroid gland, and it's a large protein that's difficult to digest. And it also triggers this protein called zonulin to open up the tight junctions in the lining of your intestines. And if you had celiac disease, which is actual autoimmune disease against gluten, then you're going to have a really long opening time from the zonulin, or from gluten impacting zonulin. And if you're gluten sensitive, it may be longer than the average person. If you're not gluten sensitive, then maybe it's short, but it's still longer than other food. So, a brief opening, couple things slipping out, sure. But when you have the longer openings, and then you have at the same time that gluten that's triggered the opening going out partially digested, then your immune system says, we don't recognize this. This doesn't belong out there. So your immune system starts attacking it. And that is what inflammation is, right? Like when you cut yourself, things start to sort of swell up, and that's a bunch of immune cells coming to try and fix something. And so that's what's happening. But that inflammation becomes chronic if you're eating this stuff every single day. And that's when the attack on the tissues in your body that resemble gluten begins. But it may not be, for one person, it may be Hashimoto's. For another person, it may be rheumatoid arthritis, or it may be lupus, depending on what your genetic susceptibility is, because there's sort of three necessary precursors. It's that genetic susceptibility, that intestinal permeability, and then some kind of an antigen. So it could be that gluten, it could be environmental toxins, it could be, you know, whatever's coming in, and maybe it's not necessarily coming in through your gut, it could be coming in through your nose, it could be pollution you breathe or some other type of thing.
Yeah, I know I've been gluten-free since 2016. That's when my son was diagnosed, and I really started to dig in because I'm a dietitian, but I was not trained on any of this. And microbiome was kind of just a newer word that nobody really knew much about. So yeah, I've kind of unraveled and exposed the same information that today's gluten is really just doing, you know, opening up the tight junctions, creating micro tears in the gut lining. And so it's been almost 9 years that I've been gluten-free, kind of like you. Like I get exposure at restaurants. I don't worry about it. It's not like I have a huge reaction anymore, but just for those reasons. And people who come to me with autoimmune issues or a lot of illness or a lot of inflammation, like I always encourage them, let's just going gluten-free is going to do nothing but help to decrease your inflammation overall. And then I had genetic testing recently that shows that I don't have celiac, but I definitely have gluten sensitivity. So I was like, okay, it's not all in my head. I'm really glad I've been gluten-free for this long. And once you're used to that lifestyle, it's really not a big deal. But I think a lot of times people, and I know this is true for my family, especially like there's people in my extended family who think it's just like, I'm just going gluten-free just because it's a cool, you know, like it's kind of trendy. It's like, no, it's not it at all. And well, what happens when you actually eat, you know, like I can tell people think it's sometimes when you say you're gluten-free that you're being difficult, or I'm like, no, but like I still like my skin is sensitive. I get some skin things going on my face. I get bloated if I eat if I eat an extensive amount of gluten, which I very rarely do. So it's not all in your head. And it's like you get these symptoms for a reason. It's your body telling yourself something is off. But you talked a little bit about the dysbiosis and like how does that even start? So you said gluten can be one of the triggers, environmental, and this is where it gets tricky. It's like, what is the trigger for me? Like, how did my gut get to be either overgrown with poor bacteria or not enough good bacteria? And for you, it sounds like it could have been like a foodborne illness thing. But what are some other triggers that we should be aware of? And you know, particularly food and foods that we can avoid to keep the gut integrity.
Yeah. So sugar, of course, is a big one. Sugar causes inflammation. Of course, you get blood sugar dysregulation if you eat too much of it, and it keeps on going. Over time, our bodies become less able to detoxify the stuff we put into them. And dairy is a sensitivity for a lot of people. It is also, I mean, I'm sure everybody notices that you get a lot more mucus production when you eat dairy. So it definitely is something that even people who digest it fine don't do so well with. I'm lactose intolerant too. So for me, it's like double whammy. And some people react to soy. I personally, I tried going soy free for about a year or two, and it didn't seem to impact my antibodies. So I went back on soy. Although mostly the soy that most people eat is usually just hidden in processed foods, although there are some fermented soy products that are fine for people who don't have any sensitivity. But in general, just a generally unhealthy diet. So, you know, processed food, seed oils, deep fried foods, processed meats, you know, all that kind of stuff, junk food. If you eat a diet like that, it's just devoid of nutrients. So not only does it have things that are bad for you in it, most of it's probably gluten and dairy, right? So that's the beginning, but it has no nutrients really. So you begin to be deficient in nutrients like zinc or chromium. You know, zinc is going to impact the gut lining and keeping that intact and healthy, and the digestive process. And you know, if you're deficient in chromium, you're going to start developing blood sugar dysregulation. If you're deficient in selenium, you're going to be at risk, or zinc, you're going to be at risk of Hashimoto's. So it's just having a diet that's devoid of nutrients over time and has a lot of inflammatory things like the omega-6 fatty acids that are, in the deep frying oil, and the byproducts of deep frying that create, trans fats and other kinds of poisonous fats and other molecules. It's just not, your body doesn't even recognize that stuff as food. They're just toxins. So your body has to spend all its time cleaning that stuff out. So that's kind of one potential way to develop dysbiosis. But if that's the way you developed it, you can probably fix that by going to like a healthy Mediterranean style diet. Other ways that you can develop dysbiosis, of course, are antibiotics. That's a big one. You take these broad spectrum antibiotics, they wipe out the good bacteria. Sometimes you then get an upgrowth of these pathogenic bacteria, and they could be ones that in particular lead to, pretty leaky gut and a leaky colon, and decrease the production of short chain fatty acids, which are super important in the colon. When you're eating a high fiber diet, a healthy diet, that fiber is being fermented by the bacteria in the colon, and they are producing short chain fatty acids, including butyrate, that feed the cells lining the colon. And when you become devoid of those, you get sort of a leaky colon, and usually leads to looser stool and potentially diarrhea. And then you're getting and these are all gram-negative bacteria, which are the ones that have on the lining of the bacteria something called lipopolysaccharide, or LPS, which is an endotoxin. So it's a toxic to us. And as that escapes, it creates inflammation in the body and blood sugar dysregulation. So that can be the origin of type 2 diabetes right there through your gut and through the these bacteria that are exiting. So, it's quite possible through supplementing butyrate to turn that pattern around in the colon, because as you give that food back to the colonocytes, the cells lining the colon, then it seals it back up again, and it lets, the oxygen, it becomes oxygen free or hypoxic. And the hypoxic environment is amenable to the growth of the anaerobic bacteria, which are the ones that produce the butyrate, versus the facultative anaerobes, which can live in the presence of oxygen and will pull oxygen in to feed the colon cells. So it's a whole process of undoing that dysbiosis.
Yeah.
And then I would say the third piece is stress. Stress can also lead to a lot of disruption in the gut microbiome, which begins with usually either a low secretory IgA, which is your gut immune defense system, and therefore more pathogens are getting in. It could also lead to low stomach acid. And so again, more pathogens are getting in. And then you start to get this dysbiosis pattern over time.
Yeah. So crappy food, devoid of no nutrients. And it's not only just devoid of nutrients, it's devoid of enzymes then. And enzymes are what really help you to digest food.
This is true. Yeah.
And,
Yeah, a lot of countries eat papaya and pineapple before their meals because those have great enzymes for digesting food.
Well, any food in its whole natural form has because you see like the enzymes pulled from pineapple to put into supplements a lot, but their enzymes will be in the perfect amount in that food to help you digest it. So, and high heat and additives and chemicals are going to kill those enzymes. So I always tell people, like, even like applesauce, you eat applesauce versus an apple or pasteurized milk. Like all of the enzymes and bacteria and all the things that are in that food it's perfectly in that food to help you digest it are gone. And then, you add in medications and antacids and you can just see how we've created this perfect storm of digestive issues. And we can come back to that low stomach acid in a little while. But that's a huge factor of why people aren't digesting well. And like things that are, you get all these bloating issues and symptoms, or you're not pooping, or you're pooping too often. And sometimes it goes back to the stomach and things not happening there that are supposed to be happening. So food, antibiotics, and stress. I do want to talk a little bit more about the antibiotics and make sure we're not missing anything there. So my daughter, who's now 21, she struggled with acne since she was, went through prepubescent, and she had extensive antibiotics when she was 9 because her appendix ruptured and she was in the hospital for days. And anyway, I didn't know everything that I know now back then, but we did a whole gut protocol on her a couple years ago, and she took all of this, gut support to help with the lining, and she developed PCOS because her hormones got all off. I mean, it was just this whole big thing. And she did the gut protocol and did food sensitivity testing, did it all, and her acne cleared very nicely. Well, she had her wisdom teeth out in August, and of course was prescribed antibiotics. And I was like, oh, like she hadn't taken antibiotics in years. And I'm like, oh, I know, like, I'm so afraid for you to take those. And I think she took a day or two of them, and that was it. But then she developed like an abscess in one of her surgery spots that stayed there and was draining and like infected for 3 months. So we had no choice but to do like a full round of antibiotics, and she had to have it drained and more surgery. But anyway, it was within 2 or 3 days of her taking those antibiotics, her face just boom, like loaded with acne. And we're like, oh, we were so sad. We like did all this work. So she's like, how do I get back to like a healthy gut that I had before? So she was doing she was doing gelatin and some fermented foods, and I reordered some of the supplements to help the gut lining. But is there anything we're missing? Like if somebody comes to you and they've been on extensive rounds of antibiotics, like do you have to do the testing first to kind of see what they need, or do you have like a specific antibiotic protocol? Because I'm sure, it's like almost all of us at some time, and I'm not poo-pooing antibiotics completely because, my daughter had a mouth infection, and
you have to take them when you have to take them.
Sometimes you just have to do it, even though you know what they're going to do. So yeah, help us with that.
Yeah, well, okay. So first of all, the one thing you do not ever need to take antibiotics for are the initial symptoms of what is clearly a viral infection, which is colds and flu. Right. So antibiotics kill bacteria, they don't kill viruses. So if you go to your doctor because you've had a few days of a stuffy nose or you feel like crap, and it's clearly a viral illness, don't accept antibiotics. They may offer them to you because they just want to get you off their back, and they know you don't come in expecting them to say, have some bed rest and a lot of liquids and some chicken soup and come back,
wait it out a week.
If it doesn't go away in a week, these kind of things should go away within a week. Now, if you do have a viral infection that seems to like be getting better, but then it like doubles down, like you had a sore throat that went away for a few days, but then it comes back. Now you might have a secondary bacterial infection that may actually require antibiotics. That's a different story. But just the basic virus from the get-go that kind of gets worse and then slowly gets better, that's not something that should be treated with antibiotics. So not taking unnecessary antibiotics is the first piece. The second piece is while you're taking antibiotics, you can protect yourself. And there was one big study about taking probiotics with antibiotics that found that, in fact, it took much longer to get your gut back to a healthy gut microbiome if you took probiotics while on antibiotics.
Interesting.
So in general, I don't recommend that, except for one particular probiotic called Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a probiotic yeast. And one of my gut health mentors at PhD studying the microbiome, Lucy Mailing, recommends 3 times a day 2 pills or 500 milligrams of Saccharomyces boulardii while on antibiotics, and probably continuing for, maybe a month after or something. And then butyrate, the best form of that is going to be either Tributrin or a product. I actually have my own product called Tributrin Max. And then there's other forms like Corbiome and Probutyrate that are also good, but better than the sodium butyrates and those ones like that. So those are the best forms for getting to the colon and feeding those colon cells, because that's exactly what's going to happen is your body's ability to produce butyrate while you're on antibiotics is decreased because it's wiping out those anaerobic bacteria. And then you're going to have that switch over to those facultative anaerobes in your gut that don't produce butyrate. And so to keep that from happening, if you can take the butyrate while you're on antibiotics, and usually I always tell people, take it based on what the quality of your stool is. Like a lot of people will get antibiotic associated diarrhea. That's when you really know you need that butyrate. If you're constipated while you're on antibiotics, then you probably don't need additional butyrate. You're probably okay. But if you start to get loose stool or messy stool, then you can take the butyrate sort of to tolerance, like till you have firm, good, clean wiping stool. If you have constipation, you should back down your dose. So that's what I recommend during antibiotics. Now, afterwards, you can also do that. If you've seen that change in your bowel movements, you can also get on the Espelarti, and you can get on the butyrate at that point. The other things you can do is just eat a very healthy diet while you're on antibiotics and after. So if you're eating a lot of sugar, if you're eating junk food, you're just going to be feeding those pathogenic bacteria. So you just want to be careful to be really good with your diet. And then, of course, the other thing that really happens when people are on antibiotics is they're going to be wiping out a lot of bacteria. So the yeast are going to overgrow. So you might find you get a candida overgrowth. And I find that candida is very associated with skin stuff. So, it can become invasive. It can grow these hyphae, or these little sort of tails out, pushing out through the cells in your intestine. And those cells can then, then it becomes an invasive candidiasis, which is going throughout your entire system in your bloodstream and such. So not letting the sugar take over. But sometimes you do need treatment for candida, and often people need treatment for yeast infections following antibiotics.
Yeah. And I know I still, like, if I eat more sugar than normal, I'll like break out a little bit, because I think I am. I've always wondered, like, I haven't been tested for it, but if I have candida issues, because I am really I feel sick if I eat more sugar than normal. Like, I'm like, stomach hurts. I don't feel good. Some of it's the inflammation, but so the candida, so that's the yeast you usually do. Is there something that, like, an anti-yeast supplement, or is that something that you need more of a prescription to help out with?
I mean, you could see your doctor. Good luck with you if you don't actually have a yeast infection or thrush in your mouth. Good luck getting anything for that. Right. But if you see a functional medicine person, you could get antifungal things like nystatin or fluconazole. Those would be, prescriptions. Yeah. And naturally, there's various things that help. So undesolenic acid, caprylic acid, Colorex, MSM. There are different and biocidin is one of my favorites for yeast, and in particular, if people have both yeast and bacteria. So there's different products that you can use for getting rid of yeast.
Okay. I love the biocidin. I learned about that when my son was really sick, like their throat spray. Whenever I feel it tickle.
Oh, the throat spray is magic.
And I just keep spraying it like 10 times a day.
Yeah, I'm just like gone in like a minute.
Yeah. I know. And I tell everybody about it. My daughter and son both at college, they both have their own throat sprays. I'm like, you let me know if you're getting low on that, because I'll get you some.
Yeah. I feel the same way about their dental rinse, their dentalcidin. Whenever anybody has any dental issues, or even if, they have like high strep in their mouth, showing up in their gut stool test, then you think, okay, or fusobacterium, like I put them on the dentalcidin mouth rinse.
Sure. I didn't know about the dentalcidin. I'll have to.
Oh yeah, that's great for dental issues.
When they had, I said both my son and daughter both had their wisdom teeth out on the same. And I had a lot of reservations. I'm like, oh, do they really need to do this? And it's like, you talk to so many different people. But I'm like, they both had like, orthodontic work. I'm like, oh, the last thing I want is to like shove all of that orthodontic thousands of dollars worth of work. You don't want to mess with it. But yeah. So anyway, that's helpful to know about for that. Okay. So let's go back to the blood sugar and the weight loss a little bit, because a lot of times people and I have a lot of clients that I work with, and I was kind of like this for a while too, where and I'll use an example just this morning. Somebody who enrolled into my low insulin academy and has like high blood sugars and is in the pre-diabetic range. Her fasting insulin is normal, which I was like, oh my gosh, that's weird. And some cholesterol issues, but low triglycerides. So I was like, all right, let's try to connect all the dots here. But a lot of times people are not associating blood sugar issues and weight issues with gut health issues. And they might spin their wheels and go round and round and say, oh, like I'm eating low carb. I'm, exercising after my meals. I'm only eating a couple times a day. I might even be doing some intermittent fasting. Like, why do I still have these high blood sugars? So give us some perspective on that with blood sugar and weight issues. Like, how are they coming into gut microbiome issues? Like how are they?
So I did talk about the LPS that's coming out of the leaky colon. So that, can trigger that systemic inflammation, which can impair insulin signaling and can lead to insulin resistance. So that's one piece. Now, what's going on in the colon specifically with the bacteria is, so there's some commensal bacteria that should be present in your colon, and it's the butyrate producers, in particular Faecalibacterium prausnitzii. That's one you often see low on stool tests or non-existent. And that's particularly if you've been on a lot of rounds of strong antimicrobials like berberine or oregano oil or garlic potentially. And also, of course, antibiotics. And then Rosaburia is another butyrate producing family, and a lot of the Clostridia, not the ones like C. diff, but other Clostridium bacteria are also butyrate producers. And then the other one is called Akkermansia muciniphila, and that lives in the mucin layer of your gut, and it is sort of eating at that mucus layer, but in a good way, like it's keeping it refreshing and keeping it going. And it works in symbiosis with those other butyrate producing bacteria. So, they're feeding each other different short chain fatty acids. And that one has been studied pretty extensively to the point that even people are even taking heat-killed Akkermansia now, because somehow it produces probably some postbiotic that is helping with blood sugar regulation. So they now have a probiotic version. It was the first anaerobic probiotic, I believe, that came out. Pendulum makes Akkermansia, and that is something that if you do a stool test and you see is not present in your gut, or if you have blood sugar issues, you could certainly try it. They have their original product was called Glucose Control, and then they have a metabolic daily, but now they also have like Pendulum Akkermansia Pro, and then like a lower dose version. So you can try various of those products to try and reimplant the Akkermansia. I think the protocol they recommend now, if you're missing Akkermansia, is 6 months of the Akkermansia Pro, and then move to like a metabolic daily, which would be your daily blood sugar regulation kind of probiotic. There are other probiotics that I like as well for blood sugar dysregulation, and that's there's a BiotiQuest makes one called Sugar Shift that helps turn some of the simple sugars like glucose and what's the other one? Glucose and maybe sucrose into mannitol, which does not have the same blood sugar impact, and is particularly helpful for people who have constipation. So there's a couple ways that, in terms of intervening at the microbiome level, that you can change that picture. Gut bacteria can also influence the production of certain hormones like the GLP-1, which all the GLP-1 drugs that people are taking, the Ozempics and the Wegovy's and such, and peptide YY, and those help regulate appetite and glucose metabolism and insulin secretion. So if you have dysbiosis, you may not have the gut bacteria present to produce those hormones, and they may be reduced, and therefore you have problems with glucose regulation. And those these GLP-1s in particular, slow gastric emptying, and they keep the food in the stomach longer, which signals fullness to the brain. And they also interact with the appetite regulating areas in hypothalamus to reduce hunger. So that's another way that gut dysbiosis can lead to overeating and or blood sugar dysregulation. And then there's also communication between the gut microbiome and the liver. And so you can have dysregulated gluconeogenesis, so the production of glucose by the liver, and that can also exacerbate blood sugar issues. So those are a few ways that your microbiome interacts with blood sugar.
That's phenomenal. And it's like I know I don't know all this stuff. Like I know the basics, but yes, you wouldn't realize that dysbiosis can cause all of these issues. So question about the GLP-1s, have you seen, and maybe it hasn't been long enough, but people who are taking GLP-1s, have you seen that disrupt the gut microbiome? Because we know that it really suppresses appetite and it slows gastric emptying, but have you seen anybody taking
I only have one client who was formerly on a GLP-1 and who had problems, with slowed gastric emptying that was to the point where it was problematic, and just didn't feel good on it. I can't remember the exact issues. So Yeah.
Okay.
That,
Yeah,
that's
and there are ways to naturally increase that GLP-1 for sure.
right. And one of the ways is with that Akkermansia probiotic.
Yeah,
Well, they actually have a GLP-1 probiotic that's a combo of a few strains from Pendulum too.
yeah. Rather than put yourself on, a medication that's so expensive and can cause issues because it's at higher amounts than what the body naturally produces. So what are you doing for testing to see what's going on with all of this?
Yeah.
Like
So
we
I
can
would,
talk about like you can try this or this, but it's like unless
yeah, so it depends on the person and the symptoms, but I would usually do some type of a comprehensive stool test. And I'm leaning more and more towards, so I sort of always started with stool tests. Then for a while I was starting to use breath tests more. And I just keep finding that like a breath test seems often misses people who clearly have SIBO. Like they bloat the minute they eat. Like to me, that's such an obvious sign of SIBO that I'm not even gonna, even if it doesn't show up on a test, I'm still probably gonna treat
yeah.
for it, or teach them how to treat themselves for it. So so usually a comprehensive stool test. My favorites right now are the Tiny Health Pro, because it's a metagenomic sequencing, so I can see everything that's in their gut, plus it's got the gut health markers like that secretory IgA, the pancreatic elastase, a couple markers of potential inflammatory bowel disease like calprotectin and lactoferrin. It's got, different inflammatory markers. It's got the short chain fatty acids. So it's a good, and beta glucuronidase, which is really important if you're concerned about potential breast cancer, colon cancer, making sure that you've got the right microbes in there. So that's one of my favorites right now. And then if people have potential, if they have symptoms of H. pylori, like if they have upper GI stuff, reflux, pain when there's nothing in their stomach, insomnia, things like that, then I will probably do a US Biotech GI Advanced Profile, which is my other favorite because it's got all of the gut health markers and a lot of different bacteria, commensals and pathogenic, and all the worms, and there's some viruses and protozoa, things like that. So that one, the parasites. So that one, but it also has the H. pylori virulence factors, which tell you if it's an H. pylori infection that's going to potentially create an ulcer or stomach cancer. So I like that for somebody who has those symptoms.
Sure.
So those are the two that I like to use the most. And then for Candida, I'm using organic acids testing to see if the arabinose or diarabinitol or arabinitol markers are elevated. That's the primary marker for invasive candidiasis.
Okay. So has the Tiny Health Pro kind of, like I always thought the kind of gold standard being that a lot of GI health experts had been using was the GI map. Is the Tiny Health Pro kind of taken over for that? And
I don't know if it's taken over, but given that you can get the metagenomic sequencing, because I'll tell you what I'm looking for, and more, and because I get like the worst cases of people with gut health issues. The people I see have complex stuff. Like they don't typically have just one thing going on in their gut, like hydrogen SIBO. They have like 2 or 3 things going on in their gut. So with the metagenomic sequencing, I can see every bug that's in their gut, and in particular, the ones that produce hydrogen sulfide, because there's a lot of those. There's the Fusobacterium, there's the Disulfovibrio, and Proteus mirabilis. That's another one. So these aren't all on most of those tests. If you don't get the metagenomic sequencing, I don't think you get all of those. And then also Klebsiella, that's another one. And some of the E. coli produce hydrogen sulfide. So I want to be able to see all that stuff. So that's why I like that. But yes, the GI map is price-wise the lowest where you can get a lot of good information. So that was what I was using a lot before the US Biotech came around, and the GI map doesn't have the short chain fatty acids. So that's why I like the US Biotech above it.
Okay, gotcha. What else are we missing here? Travel.
Stomach acid.
Yeah. Let's go back to the stomach acid because that creates a lot of issues for people. And beyond medications. And so I think you can correct me if I'm wrong. The 2 things that are really causing low stomach acid are crappy food that has no enzymes to age, and then medications that people what else is causing low stomach acid, and what is happening when we don't have enough stomach acid to digest our protein?
So here's one that maybe many people might be missing who are trying to eat healthy. You go off all your processed food, you eat a super healthy food diet, and you're like, salt's bad for you. I'm not going to use much salt. I'm going to be super sparing. And sodium chloride, that's what's in salt. Chloride, that's what's in hydrochloric acid. So you low on chloride. If you look at your blood tests, your CB or CMP, and you see chloride below 100, you might not be getting enough salt to produce stomach acid. So that's a super easy one to fix. And then you might not have enough zinc. So say you have a deficiency, again, the crappy food, that could be causing it. Stress, I think, might have an impact.
Yeah, that's another thing for sure.
So sometimes it's a little bit mysterious, but for some people, or maybe you went on PPIs and then your body just never quite recovered. So proton pump inhibitors, they can sometimes have a longer term impact on stomach acid. Drinking alkaline water
that I've seen is people who have been on PPIs for years when they're counterintuitive. They're doing the exact opposite. You think
they're right. Yeah. And I was one of those cases too, that I was on PPIs for 10 years because of I had silent reflux.
Yeah. And it's so hard to wean off because you get all the symptoms back.
Yeah. Well, for me, the symptoms weren't bad. Like it wasn't like bad burning. So that was not the problem. It was a constant cough. And it took a while for them to realize it was reflux because it's the LPR, the laryngopharyngeal reflux. That's, it's much more subtle in its symptoms. For some people, and hoarseness in the throat, and sometimes people it comes all the way up into the sinuses and causes issues there. So that reflux for me was mostly manifesting as a chronic cough, and that's why I was on the PPIs for 10 years. Didn't realize how dangerous they were. Of course, they'd gone on over the counter soon after I went on them.
Right.
And it wasn't until much later that they started saying only 2 weeks worth. So I eventually, when I went off dairy, I was able to go off the PPIs.
Okay.
So so those are some of the reasons people might have low stomach acid. But if you do have low stomach acid, often the symptoms are exactly like those of high stomach acid, which is reflux. And so one of the things I did do was to go off the PPIs and to try betaine HCl to see if that would help with the symptoms, and it did. And so I was on that for a while, and I'm on it again now. For whatever reason, I don't seem to keep up my stomach acid, and it is not for lack of salt.
No, I have some clients who and maybe for a while it was because of the medications, and you took the betaine HCl and it increased. Like I always do the betaine HCl and enzymes to help people to further digest their food. But and then you just wonder if age and environmental things like those just kind of play a role after a while too.
Yeah. But the important part is that if you have low stomach acid, you will not be breaking apart your proteins into amino acids well. And there's one particular amino acid called L-carnitine. And also, if you are on a vegan or vegetarian diet, L-carnitine comes particularly from beef and from lamb, but maybe less or so from chicken and pork. And so if you're not getting it through your diet, your body has to produce it. It comes from L-lysine, which is one of the essential amino acids. And L-carnitine is one of the 2 nutrients necessary for bringing fats into the Krebs cycle so that you can produce energy. And so you need vitamin B2 and L-carnitine. So if you're deficient in either of those, then you're not going to be burning fats for energy. And if you're not burning fats for energy, you're storing them and you're feeling very low energy and you can't make it from one meal to the next. So you're going to probably want to eat more and more carbs because the fats will give you 4 hours of satiation, but in the protein 3 hours and the carbs 2 hours. So you're going to want to eat every couple hours or maybe every 3 if you've been eating good amount of protein. So that's, a real important piece on the whole blood sugar regulation thing, because then you'll start to have much more, swings in your blood sugar because you're not having the fats keeping that steady flow of energy.
Yeah. And I know for, with blood sugar regulation and cortisol issues, like I'm teaching a protein centered diet with some fatty acids and, some good carbohydrates. And, like if women, like I'm eating 100 grams of protein, but I still I'm lethargic. My hair's falling out. I have brittle nails or whatever, like my skin's really dry. I'm like, okay, but you're eating it doesn't mean it's getting broken down and absorbed. So do you have a lot of bloating? Do you have other issues where we might see that your protein is not being utilized like it should. So yeah, I always tell people that, like, just because you're eating something doesn't mean you're actually yeah, absorbing and using it. So there's just so much that goes in, and it's amazing that we can look at what we can look at this point for sure. I did want to ask you, okay, so we talked about bloating and probiotics. I did want to ask you about red light therapy, and if you use that at all, because I've been delving really extensively into like circadian health and quantum biology, and using red light therapy more and more with the people that I work with. And of course, going outside and being in the sun is going to be the best way to get red light. But have you seen, or have you used on your clients? Like, I have seen a lot of literature on how the microbiome can shift and change when using red light therapy, or putting, making sure your abdomen is exposed to sunlight. When we're able, like, I live in Wisconsin, and right now I can't, I'm not able to do that. But have you used that as a therapy, or seen any literature on that where you kind of use that as an adjunct therapy?
To be honest, no, that's not something that I've delved into, so I don't have a lot of knowledge in that area.
Okay, I was just curious because yes, and I've seen how, and maybe you've heard this too, like, and how the microbiome can shift and change with the seasons, which makes sense, because if we're actually eating what's available to us in our environment naturally, that would make sense. Like right now in Wisconsin, there is no UV light whatsoever. There's no produce growing around me. So if I'm going to, take in 5 or 6 servings of fruit a day and vegetables, like, my microbiome probably isn't primed for that like it would be in the summer. So, is there anything on that you want to add to, or have you seen like the shifts and changes in the microbiome from season to season, or not really?
Well, I do live in Arizona now, and I've always lived in warmer places, so I definitely don't have that quite sense of seasonality where I live. I generally, nevertheless, I generally would just recommend people try and get 30 or 40 different types of fruits and vegetables, including nuts and seeds and herbs and things like that, a week, just to keep up the variety. And then polyphenols are really important. So if you're trying to build back up those choline butyrate producers in the Akkermansia, things like pomegranate, or you could use the pomegranate concentrate, or the powder, cranberries, same thing, the concentrate or the powder, matcha, those are really good polyphenols for bringing those up.
Yeah.
And those are things that, they may not be seasonally available to you, but they're good for the gut microbiome. So it's not just the fiber, but the fiber is important, of course. And beans and lentils, like, to me, that is it. The beans and lentils are indispensable. You'll never get your 20, 25, 30 grams of fiber a day if you're not eating beans and lentils, because you cannot get enough fiber from a bowl of lettuce to meet your needs. You need some of these higher fiber foods like the beans and lentils. So I'm a big fan of those.
Yeah. Especially if you can digest. Like, I can only take in a certain amount, and I start to get a little bloated, but I have to make sure.
Yeah, but most people can handle a quarter cup a day or something. So
yes.
Yeah, and there's different types that are you can try. If one doesn't agree with you so well, another might.
Yeah. Anything we missed about? I know we had talked a little bit about before we started recording, like, about traveling.
Oh yeah.
That you have for that.
So I was gonna mention serum bovine immunoglobulins. So they are, at this point, I think only available in the US and Australia, and I'm not sure if you can even get them in Europe or in Canada, but they are a derivative of colostrum. So, well, I'm sorry, that's not true. They're not a derivative. They're similar to colostrum in that colostrum will have some serum bovine immunoglobulins. So in other places you could get that, but that is a dairy product. They are pulled from the plasma of the cow. So they are not a dairy product. And basically, it's just taking all those immune cells out of, it's the IgG primarily, with some IgM and some IgA, pulled out of the immune system of the cow and turned into a powder. And so if you're traveling and you're going to be eating sketchy food, which, for me, anything in a developing country is potentially sketchy food, anything washed with water in a developing country that doesn't have good sanitation. Obviously, don't drink the water, don't brush your teeth with the water, don't swallow it while you're in the shower. But you do those basic things, and you if you can put this SBI powder on your food and have a little bit each day, then you can probably avoid the worst of what might be some kind of episode of food poisoning. And I just, it's interesting because I had a client who got his gut back into great shape, primarily using the SBI powder. And it's a great selective antimicrobial because it binds to pathogens like H. pylori or C. diff or the cytolethal distending toxin B, which is the toxin that comes from like the salmonella and the E. coli poisoning and the things that the typical case of autoimmune IBS, SIBO comes from. So it binds to these toxins and these pathogens, and it just carries them out in the stool.
Yeah.
And it does not hurt your good bacteria. So if you can carry that while you're traveling, then you might avoid. Oh, so I was talking about that client, right? So the client, he'd gotten his gut back in good shape, and then he went, sure enough, to Costa Rica, and he got food poisoning, but he was using the SBI powder on every meal. So he still got the food poisoning for a day, but he got better. And he said, after it went away for he had diarrhea for a day, but things got better quickly. And he kept taking the SBI powder. And we ran another stool test, and sure enough, he had, I can't remember whether it was, I think it was high levels of C. diff or something else still showing up in his stool. But because he'd been taking that SBI powder, the symptoms went away quickly. He did not have a serious case of it. And by the time, he went through, a couple more bottles of it, then he was totally fine. And he never had to do any kind of antibiotics or anything serious.
Yeah, C. diff can be nasty. You don't want to C. diff, that can hospitalize.
I'm pretty sure it was C. diff. It was one of those that shows up on the GI map early on in the pathogens section. So those are the bad ones.
Oh, wow. All right. So if people suspect they have gut issues or want to work with you, how are you working with people? And kind of what would the protocol be for them to go through?
I see people one-on-one, and I either offer packages of 3 and 5 appointments, or they can just pay for individual appointments at a time if that's the only way that's feasible for them. I offer a free 30-minute session initially for anyone who just wants to talk to me about their gut health issues. And, we can see if it's a good fit and if I feel like I can help them. And typically I send people out for testing, be it stool or occasionally breath or candida, the organic acids testing or, nutrient things, depending on what they're, presenting with. And and then we go from there. So that's how they work with me.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I know this can all get really complex. So I think it's a really good avenue to try if you feel like you've done so many things lifestyle wise and you're still not making the progress that you want to make, or have a lot of inflammation that you can't figure out, blood sugar issues, weight issues, figure out. The gut microbiome can definitely play a huge role. So, well, thanks for coming on today and sharing all your knowledge. It's always, like I said at the beginning, it's always interesting to have gut experts on here. And everybody works a little bit differently and offers hope to people who feel really lost.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me.